The muzzle flash lit up the jungle like lightning, and I felt our Sherman rock backward as the 75mm gun roared. Through the smoke and steam rising from our barrel, I watched our armor-piercing round punch clean through the side of the Japanese Type 97 Kaya tank. The enemy machine erupted in orange flame, its ammunition cooking off in a series of thunderous explosions that sent chunks of steel spinning through the bamboo canopy above us. "Target destroyed," I shouted over the roar of our Detroit diesel engine. But even as I said it, I could see two more Japanese tanks emerging from the green hell of the Philippine jungle. They told us the Japanese didn't have tanks. That was a lie. My name is Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, and I commanded an M4A3 Sherman tank in the 44th Tank Battalion during the liberation of Luzon in the Philippines. It was February 1945, and we were driving north toward Manila, cutting through jungle terrain that no tank was ever meant to fight in. The brass had assured us that Japanese armor was practically non-existent in the Pacific theater. Maybe a few obsolete light tanks, they said. Nothing your Shermans can't handle. As I watched that third Kaiha swing its short-barreled 47mm gun toward us, I realized how deadly wrong they had been. The invasion of Luzon had begun on January 9th, when General MacArthur's 6th Army hit the beaches at Lingayen Gulf. Our tank battalion had come ashore 3 days later, part of the massive American force tasked with liberating the Philippines and crushing Japanese resistance once and for all. After 3.5 years of brutal island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, we were finally within striking distance of Japan itself. But first, we had to break the back of General Yamashita's 14th Area Army, which had turned the mountainous jungles of northern Luzon into a fortress. I had been fighting in the Pacific for 2 years, ever since graduating from the Armored Training School at Fort Knox in early 1943. I'd seen action with the 1st Marine Division on Bougainville, where our Shermans had supported infantry assaults against dug-in Japanese positions. In the Pacific, tank warfare was different from what our boys were experiencing in Europe. Instead of massive armored clashes across open plains, we fought in steaming jungles and coral atolls, using our tanks primarily as mobile artillery and bunker busters. The Japanese rarely deployed armor against us. Their strategy relied on infantry armed with mines, satchel charges, and suicidal determination. Until Luzon, I had never faced another tank in combat. Our Sherman, which we had nicknamed Detroit Thunder, was a 40-ton monster armed with a high-velocity 75mm main gun and 230 caliber machine guns. The crew consisted of 5 men, myself as tank commander, Corporal Mike Sullivan from Boston as our gunner, Private First Class Eddie Washington from Alabama as our loader, Private Jimmy Chen from San Francisco as our driver, and Private Danny O'Malley from Chicago as our assistant driver and bow gunner. We had been together since training, and in 2 years of combat, we had learned to function as a single deadly organism. When Sullivan identified a target, Washington hid around in the breach before the turret stopped rotating. When Chen saw an obstacle, O'Malley already had his machine gun trained on potential ambush positions. We were good, but the jungle of Luzon was about to test us like nothing ever had. The morning of February 15th started like most others during our drive north. We had bivouacked the night before in a small clearing near the town of Umingon, about 60 miles north of Manila. The air was thick with humidity, and mosquitoes swarmed around us as we performed our daily maintenance. I was checking the track tension when Lieutenant Morrison, our platoon leader, called the tank commanders together for our briefing. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, spreading a map across the hood of his Jeep, "intelligence reports Japanese forces have established a defensive line about 5 miles ahead of us, running east-west along this ridgeline. Our job is to punch through and keep the advance moving toward Baguio." He pointed to a winding dirt road that snaked through dense jungle. "The infantry will advance on foot through the jungle on both flanks. We'll take the road and provide fire support." I studied the map, noting how the road curved through a narrow valley between 2 steep ridges covered in thick forest. It looked like perfect ambush terrain. "Sir, what about enemy armor?" I asked. "Any intelligence on Japanese tanks in this sector?" Morrison shook his head. "Negative, Sergeant. Standard defensive positions with infantry, machine guns, and maybe some light artillery. Nothing your Shermans can't handle." He folded up the map. "Move out in 30 minutes. Stay alert and keep your intervals." As I walked back to Detroit Thunder, I felt a familiar tightness in my stomach. After 2 years of combat, I had learned to trust my instincts, and something about this mission felt wrong. The Japanese were too smart to leave such an obvious avenue of approach completely undefended. They had to know we would use the road to bring up our heavy equipment. "How's it look, Sarge?" Sullivan asked as I climbed back into the turret. Mike was 22 years old, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. But he was the best gunner I had ever worked with, capable of putting rounds on target at ranges that amazed even veteran tankers. "Textbook advance through jungle terrain," I replied, settling into my commander's position and putting on my headset. "Keep your eyes open for ambushes." Something doesn't smell right about this one. At 0830 hours, our column moved out. Lieutenant Morrison led in his Sherman, followed by 2 more tanks from 1st Platoon, then our tank bringing up the rear. Behind us came a company of infantry from the 43rd Division, riding in half tracks and on foot. The narrow dirt road barely accommodated our 26-foot wide Shermans, and branches scraped against our turret as Chin navigated between the trees. The jungle pressed in on us from both sides, a green wall of bamboo, vines, and enormous hardwood trees draped with creeping vegetation. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, we moved through a twilight world of shadows and filtered sunlight. Our Detroit diesel engine echoed off the jungle walls, announcing our presence to anyone within miles. Birds screamed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the chatter of monkeys disturbed by our passage. For the first hour, we encountered no resistance. The road climbed steadily upward, following the contours of the ridge, and I began to think that maybe intelligence had been right for once. Maybe the Japanese had pulled back to more defensible positions deeper in the mountains. Then Chin's voice crackled through the intercom. "Commander, I'm seeing fresh tire tracks in the mud ahead. Heavy vehicles, and they're recent." I trained my binoculars forward, studying the road surface. Chin was right. The deep ruts in the red clay soil had been made by tracked vehicles, and the sharp edges of the impressions indicated they were less than a day old. More disturbing was the width of the tracks. They were too wide to be from American equipment, and too narrow to be from our own tanks. "All Tomcat units, this is Tomcat 6, Lieutenant Morrison's voice came over the radio. "I'm seeing signs of heavy vehicle movement ahead. Reduce speed and maintain interval." "Over." "Tomcat 4, roger," I replied, using my tank's call sign. Through the jungle canopy ahead, I could see Morrison's Sherman slow to a crawl as it rounded a bend in the road. That's when all hell broke loose. The first Japanese tank appeared like a ghost from the jungle, emerging from a camouflaged position barely 50 yards ahead of Morrison's Sherman. It was a Type 97 Kaiha medium tank, painted in jungle camouflage and festooned with cut vegetation. The Kaiha was smaller than our Sherman, weighing only 15 tons compared to our 40, but its short-barreled 47mm gun was perfectly adequate for the close-range jungle fighting we now found ourselves in. "Enemy tank, 12 o'clock. Morrison's gunner shouted over the radio, but the Japanese crew fired first. The Kaiha's main gun belched smoke and flame, and I watched in horror as the armor-piercing round struck Morrison's Sherman just below the turret. The shell punched through the relatively thin side armor and exploded inside the fighting compartment. Morrison's tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from every opening. A moment later, the ammunition stored inside the turret began to cook off, sending secondary explosions rippling through the hull. I could see figures bailing out of the escape hatches, but at least 2 of the crew weren't moving fast enough. The entire tank was engulfed in flames within seconds. Sullivan shouted, "They got the lieutenant." But there was no time to mourn. Even as Morrison's Sherman burned, I spotted movement in the jungle to our left. Another Kaiha was moving through the trees, trying to flank our column. This one had been modified with additional armor plates welded to its front hull and turret, probably salvaged from destroyed American equipment. "Target left, 300 yards, I shouted. "Tank in the trees." Sullivan traversed the turret with practiced precision, and I heard the electric motor whine as our 75mm gun swung toward the target. The Japanese tank crew had spotted us as well, and they were frantically trying to bring their gun to bear. It was going to be a race to see who could fire first. "On the way," Sullivan called, and our Sherman shook as the main gun fired. I watched our tracer round streak through the jungle and strike the Kaiha's turret with a shower of sparks. But instead of penetrating, the round ricocheted off the additional armor plating and disappeared into the canopy above. No penetration," Washington shouted as he slammed another round into the breach. "They've got extra armor." The Japanese tank's reply came instantly. Their 47mm gun fired with a sharp crack, and I felt our Sherman rock as the round struck our front hull. Fortunately, our 4-inch thick frontal armor was more than adequate to stop the relatively light Japanese shell, and the round bounced off harmlessly. "No damage," Chen reported from the driver's position. "But I can't maneuver off the road. Too much vegetation on both sides." I realized we were trapped on the narrow jungle road, unable to use our superior mobility or armor thickness to advantage. This was exactly the kind of close-range slugging match where the Japanese could neutralize our technological superiority. I keyed the radio to warn the rest of the column. "All Tomcat units, this is Tomcat 4. We have multiple enemy tanks in prepared positions. They've got the road zeroed in, and we can't maneuver. I count at least 3 Kaihas, possibly more." As if to emphasize my point, a third Japanese tank opened fire from a concealed position on the right side of the road. This round struck the second Sherman in our column, commanded by Sergeant Pete Jackson. The shell hit just above the drive sprocket and disabled the track, immobilizing Jackson's tank, but not penetrating the armor. "Tomcat 2 is hit." Jackson's voice crackled over the radio. "Lost my left track, but we're still fighting. I can see that got us about 200 yards to the right." The jungle erupted in a cacophony of gunfire as both American and Japanese tanks began firing as fast as their crews could load. The confined space of the narrow road amplified every sound, and the air filled with smoke, dust, and flying vegetation torn apart by exploding shells. Sullivan had reloaded and was tracking the Kaiha that had bounced our first round. "I've got him, Sarge. Range 250, moving left to right. Fire when ready," I shouted, even as I watched another Japanese tank emerge from camouflage positions further up the road. The enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly, positioning their tanks in prepared positions on both sides of the road where they could engage us at close range while remaining relatively protected from our return fire. Our gun fired again, and this time Sullivan's aim was perfect. The armor-piercing round struck the Kaiha just above the driver's position and punched completely through the thin frontal armor. The Japanese tank stopped immediately, its engine dying as the crew was killed or wounded by the penetrating shell and the fragments of armor it sent ricocheting around the interior. "Target destroyed," Sullivan shouted, but I was already identifying our next threat. A fourth Kaiha had appeared, this one mounting what looked like a high-velocity 47mm gun in a larger turret. It was a Type 1 Kaihi, a newer model that the intelligence briefers had assured us didn't exist in the Philippines. "New target, 11 o'clock, 400 yards, I called. "That's a Kaihi, and it's got a better gun." The Type 1 proved my concern was justified. Its high-velocity gun fired with a different sound, a sharper crack that spoke of higher muzzle velocity and better armor penetrating capability. The round struck our turret, just to the right of the main gun and actually penetrated the 3-inch armor, though it failed to explode properly. Instead, the shell fragmented inside the turret, sending steel splinters ricocheting around our fighting compartment. "I'm hit," Washington screamed, clutching his left shoulder where a fragment had torn through his jacket and drawn blood. But even wounded, he continued to function, grabbing another 75mm round and struggling to load it into the breech despite the pain. "Eddie, you okay?" I shouted, even as I traversed my commander's 50 caliber machine gun toward the Kai's position. "Just a scratch, Sarge. I can keep loading." The Japanese tank was already reloading for a second shot, and I knew we had to kill it before it could fire again. A second hit in the same area might penetrate completely and kill us all. I opened fire with my heavy machine gun, walking the bullets across the Kai's turret and hoping to distract the crew long enough for Sullivan to get off a killing shot. The 50 caliber bullets sparked off the Japanese tank's armor without doing significant damage, but they had the desired effect. I could see the enemy turret hesitate as the crew took cover from the hail of bullets striking their vision ports and periscopes. "On the way," Sullivan called, and our main gun fired for the third time. At 400 yards, the 75mm high-velocity round had plenty of energy left when it struck the Kai's turret. The shell punched through the armor with ease, and I watched the Japanese tank's turret literally blow apart as its ammunition detonated in a massive secondary explosion. Pieces of the destroyed turret flew in every direction, some landing dangerously close to our own position. The Kai's hull continued to burn, sending a column of black smoke rising above the jungle canopy. "That's 2 down," I shouted, but even as I spoke, I could see that we were far from finished with this fight. More movement in the jungle indicated additional Japanese tanks moving to engage us, and I was beginning to realize that we had stumbled into a much larger force than anyone had anticipated. The radio crackled with reports from the rest of our column. "Tomcat 4, this is Tomcat 3. I count at least 6 more enemy tanks moving up from the north. They're trying to surround us." Sergeant Bill Murphy commanded Tomcat 3, the 3rd Sherman in our column, and he had a reputation for accurate reporting under fire. If he said 6 more tanks, then we were facing a full Japanese tank company. Combined with the ones we had already engaged, that meant at least 10 enemy tanks, maybe more. "All Tomcat units," I called over the radio. "This is Tomcat 4 assuming command. We need to break out of this ambush before they get us completely surrounded. Murphy, can you back up and give us some maneuvering room?" -4. There's a steep drop-off behind me, and Jackson's tank is blocking the road anyway. We're stuck here until we fight our way out." The tactical situation was becoming desperate. We were trapped on a narrow jungle road with no room to maneuver, facing superior numbers of enemy tanks in prepared positions. Our only advantages were the superior armor and firepower of our Shermans, but in the close confines of the jungle, those advantages were minimized. That's when I heard the distinctive sound of a much larger gun firing from somewhere ahead in the jungle. The shell that followed was massive, probably 75mm or larger, and it struck Murphy's Sherman with devastating effect. The round penetrated the turret front armor completely, killing Murphy and his gunner instantly and setting off the tank's ammunition in a series of violent explosions. "What was that?" Jackson's voice was tight with fear. "That wasn't no Kaiha." Through my binoculars, I could just make out the source of that massive gun blast. Partially concealed behind a stand of bamboo about 600 yards ahead was the unmistakable silhouette of a much larger Japanese tank. It appeared to be a Type 3 Kainu, armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun that was roughly equivalent to our own main armament. "That's a Kainu," I shouted over the radio. "Heavy tank, 75mm gun. He's got us outranged from that position." The Kainu represented the most advanced tank in Japanese service, and intelligence had assured us that none had been deployed to the Philippines. Seeing one here meant that either our intelligence was completely wrong, or the Japanese had managed to move heavy armor into Luzon without our knowledge. Either way, we were facing a much more dangerous opponent than anyone had anticipated. The big Japanese tank fired again, and this time the target was Jackson's immobilized Sherman. The 75mm armor-piercing round struck the turret's side and penetrated completely, killing Jackson's loader and wounding his gunner. But Jackson himself was still alive, and his tank's gun was still functional. Tomcat 2 to all units. I'm still in the fight, but I need somebody to take out that big before he finishes me off. I could see Jackson's Sherman sitting helpless on the road with its left track blown off. Smoke was rising from several hits, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the Kainu landed a killing blow. But at 600 yards, with the Japanese tank in a prepared position and partially concealed, it was going to be a difficult shot. Sullivan, can you hit that Kainu from here? I asked my gunner. Mike was already studying the target through his telescopic sight. It's going to be tough, Sarge. He's hull down behind that bamboo, and I can barely see his turret. Range is about 600, and he's got us zeroed in while we're still trying to find him. Then we need to get closer, I decided. Chin, can you get us off this road? Even just a few yards into the jungle? Our driver studied the terrain on both sides of the road. The jungle was incredibly thick, with trees growing so close together that they formed an almost impenetrable wall. But there was one spot, about 50 yards ahead, where a small stream crossed under the road through a concrete culvert. The stream bed looked wide enough to accommodate our tank, and it angled toward the left, potentially giving us a flanking shot at the Kainu. I think I can get us into that creek bed, Sarge, Chen said. But once we're in there, we might not be able to get back out. And there's no telling what the bottom is like. It was a risk, but staying on the road meant certain death. The Japanese tanks had us bracketed, and it was only a matter of time before they landed enough hits to knock us out. At least in the creek bed, we might have a chance to flank the big Kainu and get off a killing shot. Do it, I ordered. All speed to that creek bed. Washington, load armor piercing, and be ready to fire the instant Sullivan gets on target. Chen gunned our Detroit diesel engine, and Detroit Thunder lurched forward toward the creek crossing. Immediately, every Japanese tank that could see us opened fire. Shells whined overhead and exploded in the trees around us, sending branches and debris raining down on our hull. One round struck our left fender and ricocheted off, leaving a bright scar in the armor, but doing no real damage. We reached the creek crossing and Chin swung our tank hard left, crashing through the undergrowth and down the steep bank into the streambed. Water sprayed up around our tracks as we splashed into the creek, and I could hear tree branches scraping along our turret as we pushed deeper into the jungle. We're in the creek, Chin reported. Bottom's solid, but there's a lot of fallen trees ahead. I'll try to push through them. The stream angled northeast, roughly paralleling the road, but taking us deeper into the jungle and hopefully around the flank of the Japanese position. As we moved, I could hear the battle continuing behind us. Jackson's immobilized Sherman was still fighting, firing as fast as his crew could load. But he was taking more hits, and I knew he couldn't hold out much longer. After about 200 yards, the creek bed curved sharply to the left, and Chin called out excitedly, "Commander, I can see the road ahead. Looks like this stream comes back out about 300 yards north of where we started. That would put us behind the Japanese tanks that had ambushed our column. If we could get back onto the road north of their position, we could engage them from the rear where their armor was thinnest." It was exactly the kind of flanking maneuver that American tank tactics emphasized, using our mobility to gain a positional advantage over a static enemy. But as we approached the point where the creek rejoined the road, I spotted movement through the trees ahead. 2 more Kaiha tanks were positioned to cover the northern approach, apparently anticipating that we might try exactly what we were attempting. "Enemy tanks ahead," I called. 2 Kaihas, 3 o'clock, about 200 yards, The Japanese tanks had spotted us as well, and they immediately began traversing their guns toward our position. We were still partially concealed by the jungle vegetation, but as soon as we emerged from the creek bed onto the road, we would be completely exposed. We need to take them out while we've still got some cover, I decided. Sullivan, can you engage through the trees? I can try, Sarge, but there's a lot of vegetation in the way. I might not get a clean shot. There was no choice. If we waited until we had a perfect shot, the Japanese would have time to coordinate their fire and probably kill us before we could engage effectively. We had to take the shot now, while we still had the element of surprise. Fire when ready, I ordered. Sullivan had identified the closer of the two Kaihas, which was positioned behind a fallen log about 150 yards away. Our 75mm gun roared, and I watched the armor-piercing round tear through the jungle foliage and strike the Japanese tank's turret. The shell penetrated the thin armor and exploded inside, killing the crew instantly and setting off a small fire in the engine compartment. But our muzzle flash had given away our exact position, and the second Kaiha immediately returned fire. The 47mm shell struck a large tree about 10 feet to our right, exploding the trunk in a shower of splinters and dropping the massive hardwood directly across our path. Tree down ahead. Chen reported. I can't get around it. We were trapped in the creek bed with a fallen tree blocking our escape route and at least one Japanese tank still able to engage us. The second Kaiha was already reloading, and I knew its next shot would be more accurately aimed. Back up, I shouted. Get us some distance and find another way out of this creek. Chen threw Detroit Thunder into reverse, and we began backing up the creek bed as fast as our transmission could manage. The Japanese tank fired again, and this time the round passed just over our turret, so close I could hear it whistle past. If we had been 10 seconds slower, it would have hit us squarely. As we backed up the creek, I was frantically studying the terrain, looking for another way out of our predicament. The jungle pressed in on both sides, an impenetrable wall of vegetation that no tank could push through. But about 100 yards back, I spotted what looked like a game trail leading away from the creek toward higher ground. Chen, there's a trail on the right. Can you get us up that slope? Our driver studied the narrow path through the trees. It was barely wide enough for our tank, and the slope looked dangerously steep. But it was our only option other than continuing to back up the creek until we ran into more Japanese tanks. I'll try, Sarge, but if we get stuck on that slope, we're sitting ducks. Do it. Chen swung our tank toward the trail and began climbing the steep slope. Our tracks churned in the soft jungle soil, fighting for traction as we climbed at what felt like a 45-degree angle. Tree branches scraped along our hull, and I had to duck down into the turret to avoid being swept off by low-hanging vines. Halfway up the slope, our left track began to slip in the mud, and Detroit Thunder started sliding sideways toward a steep ravine. Chen gunned the engine, and our Detroit diesel roared as it fought to pull us up the treacherous incline. Come on, you beautiful, Chen shouted at our tank. Don't quit on me now. Somehow, our tracks found purchase in the rocky soil near the top of the slope, and we lurched up onto level ground. We had emerged on a small ridge that overlooked the road where our original column had been ambushed. From this vantage point, I could see the entire tactical situation laid out below us. Jackson's Sherman was still burning, his crew having finally abandoned the tank after taking several more hits. But the infantry that had been following our column had deployed into the jungle on both sides of the road and was engaging the Japanese tanks with bazookas and rifle grenades. I could see at least 3 Kaihas that had been disabled or destroyed by the infantry attack. More importantly, I now had a clear view of the big Kainu that had been causing us so much trouble. The heavy Japanese tank was positioned in a prepared revetment about 400 yards away, its crew so focused on engaging targets down on the road that they hadn't noticed our tank on the ridge above them. Sullivan, target that Kainu, I called. Range 400. bearing 180. You should have a clear shot at his engine deck from this angle. Mike traversed our turret toward the Japanese heavy tank and peered through his telescopic sight. Got him, Sarge. Beautiful shot, right down onto his rear deck armor. The top and rear armor of tanks was always the thinnest, designed primarily to protect against artillery fragments rather than direct fire from other tanks. From our elevated position, we could shoot down onto the Kainu's engine compartment, where the armor was only about 1 inch thick. Fire! Our 75mm gun fired with a tremendous roar that echoed across the jungle valley. The armor-piercing round struck the Kainu's engine deck and punched completely through the thin armor. The shell exploded inside the engine compartment, rupturing fuel lines and setting off a massive fire that quickly spread to the ammunition storage area. The Kainu's turret blew off in a spectacular explosion that sent chunks of steel flying hundreds of yards in every direction. The blast was so powerful that it knocked down several trees near the Japanese tank's position and started fires throughout the surrounding jungle. "Target destroyed," Sullivan shouted. "That big won't be bothering anyone else." From our position on the ridge, I could see that the destruction of the Kainu had a dramatic effect on the remaining Japanese tanks. Several began withdrawing deeper into the jungle, apparently deciding that the ambush had failed and it was time to retreat. The American infantry was pressing their attack from both flanks, and without their heavy tank to provide fire support, the Japanese position was becoming untenable. "All Tomcat units, this is Tomcat 4, I called over the radio. The big Kainu is destroyed, and the enemy appears to be withdrawing. Can any other tanks continue the advance?" "Tomcat 3 is gone," came the reply from one of the surviving crew members. "Murphy and his gunner are dead, and the tank's a total loss." "Tomcat 2 here." Jackson's voice was weak but determined. "My tank's finished, but most of my crew is okay. We're with the infantry now, engaging with small arms." "Tomcat 1, this is Morrison's loader," another voice reported. "Lieutenant Morrison is dead, along with our gunner. The tank burned completely. We lost everything." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as I realized that out of 4 American tanks, only Detroit Thunder was still operational. We had lost 3 Shermans and at least 8 crew members, including Lieutenant Morrison, who had been a good officer and a friend. But we had given better than we got. From my vantage point on the ridge, I could count at least 7 destroyed Japanese tanks scattered around the ambush site. The Kainu, 4 Kai has, and 2 other tanks that I couldn't identify from this distance. All were burning or had already burned out, their crews either dead or fled into the jungle. "Chin, can you get us back down to the road?" I asked. "We need to link up with the infantry and continue the advance." "I think so, Sarge. There's a trail leading down the other side of this ridge that looks like it connects to the road about half a mile ahead." As we began our descent toward the road, I reflected on what we had just experienced. The intelligence briefers had been completely wrong about Japanese armor in the Philippines. Not only did they have tanks, but they had modern, well-equipped units with competent crews who knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. The ambush had been expertly planned and executed. The Japanese had chosen their position perfectly, forcing us onto a narrow road where we couldn't maneuver and aim Genghis at close range where their lighter guns could be effective against our armor. If we hadn't been able to break out of the creek bed and gain that flanking position on the ridge, the entire column might have been destroyed. But American training, equipment, and determination had prevailed in the end. Our crews were better trained, our tanks were more reliable, and our armor was thicker. Most importantly, we had been able to adapt to the tactical situation and find a way to turn the tables on our ambushers. 20 minutes later, Detroit Thunder rejoined the main body of American forces advancing north toward Manila. The infantry had cleared the remaining Japanese from the ambush site, and combat engineers were already working to clear the road of destroyed tanks so the advance could continue. As we rolled past the burning wreckage of Morrison's Sherman, I said a silent prayer for the lieutenant and the other crew members we had lost. They had been good tankers and brave men, and their sacrifice had helped ensure that the advance toward Manila would continue. The battle in the jungle had lasted less than 2 hours, but it had been 2 hours of the most intense combat I had ever experienced. Tank-on-tank fighting was a rare occurrence in the Pacific theater, but when it did happen, it was a deadly game where the slightest mistake could mean death for an entire crew. Over the next several weeks, as we continued our advance through Luzon, we encountered Japanese armor on several more occasions. The enemy had more tanks than anyone had realized, and they used them skillfully in defensive positions where their lighter armament could be effective against our Shermans. But we had learned from that first encounter in the jungle, and we never again allowed ourselves to be trapped in such a confined space. By March 15th, American forces had liberated Manila and broken the back of Japanese resistance on Luzon. General Yamashita's 14th Area Army had been pushed into the remote mountains of northern Luzon, where they would continue to resist until the end of the war. But their armor was gone, destroyed in battles like the one we had fought in the Jungle Road, and they no longer posed a serious threat to American operations in the Philippines. Detroit Thunder and I survived the entire Philippine campaign, participating in the liberation of Manila and the final drives that cleared Japanese forces from most of Luzon. When the war ended in August 1945, we were preparing for the invasion of Japan itself, an operation that thankfully never became necessary thanks to the atomic bombs that finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to surrender. Looking back on that tank battle in the Philippine jungle, I realized it represented something important about the nature of warfare in the Pacific. The Japanese were skilled, determined opponents who used every advantage of terrain and tactics they could find. They were never the incompetent, poorly equipped enemy that some of our propaganda portrayed them to be. But American industrial might, training, and adaptability ultimately proved decisive. We had better tanks, better support, and better logistics. Most importantly, we had crews who could think on their feet and adapt to unexpected situations. The men we lost that day, Lieutenant Morrison, Sergeant Murphy, and all the others died fighting for the liberation of a people who had suffered under Japanese occupation for 3 years. Their sacrifice helped ensure that American forces could continue their advance toward Japan and bring the war to a successful conclusion. They told us the Japanese didn't have tanks. That was a lie. But it was a lie that we learned to overcome, one burning enemy tank at a time, until victory was finally ours in the jungles of the Pacific.